when a shivering boy screamed, "Don't eat that," on a busy New York street. Keanu Reeves had no idea that his simple act of compassion would unravel a chain of dangerous events. What started as a quiet night out quickly turned into a heart-pounding battle against shadowy figures, and a life-changing bond between a man and a boy who had lost everything. It was a freezing December evening in Manhattan, the kind where the glow of Christmas lights couldn't quite melt the icy chill in the air. Keanu Reeves, bundled in a simple coat and scarf, moved through the bustling streets unnoticed, blending seamlessly with holiday shoppers. But fate had other plans for the humble actor that night. Plans that began with a desperate warning and ended with a vow that would forever change two lives. As Keanu stood frozen on the snowy sidewalk, his eyes locked with the boy's, the child's face, smudged with dirt and framed by a too large hoodie, told a story of hunger, fear, and desperation. His warning, "Don't eat that," echoed in Keanu's mind as he lowered the hot dog in his hand. The bustling street seemed to blur into the background as an unspoken connection passed between them. "What's wrong?" Keanu asked gently, his voice calm yet laced with concern. The boy hesitated, his small hands trembling as he pointed toward the street vendor. "It's poisoned. I saw someone mess with the food earlier." His voice cracked with fear, but his wide, pleading eyes held no trace of dishonesty. Keanu's brow furrowed. "Poisoned?" he repeated, his tone cautious but not dismissive. The vendor, standing just a few feet away, shifted uneasily. "Look, I don't know what this kid is talking about," the man muttered, avoiding Keanu's piercing gaze. The crowd had started to take notice. Curious onlookers slowed their pace, phones discreetly raised to record the unfolding drama. "Before I share what happens next, because trust me, it gets intense, I'd love to hear from you. My amazing viewers, where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if this story is already tugging at your heartstrings, hit that like button. Let's dive back in, because what happened next shocked everyone." Keanu knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "What's your name?" he asked softly, hoping to calm the trembling child. "Elliot," the boy whispered. "I wasn't lying, I swear." His voice was shaky, but there was something so raw, so real, in his plea that it made Keanu's chest tighten. "It's okay, Elliot," Keanu said, his tone steady and reassuring. "Let's figure this out together." Keanu straightened, his calm demeanor unwavering as he turned to the vendor. "I think we should hold off on selling any more food for now," he said, handing the man the hot dog. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, offering it to Elliot. "How about we get you something warm to eat?" But Elliot didn't take the money. Instead, he shook his head, his voice breaking as he said, "I don't want your money. I don't want you to get hurt." Keanu's heart sank. This wasn't just a scared boy. It was a boy who had been ignored, overlooked, and abandoned by a world that should have protected him. In that moment, Keanu made a decision. He wasn't going to be another person who walked away. "All right," Keanu said with a kind smile. "How about you come with me? Let's get you warmed up and talk about what's going on." Elliot hesitated, his small frame tense with uncertainty. But something about Keanu, his gentle tone, his steady presence, seemed to reassure him. Slowly, he reached out, taking the hand that Keanu extended. Together, they walked through the snow-dusted streets, leaving behind the murmurs of the curious crowd and the faint glow of camera flashes. As they approached a small diner with frosted windows glowing warmly against the winter night, Keanu pushed open the door, guiding Elliot inside. The aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, a sharp contrast to the icy chill outside. Keanu gestured for Elliot to sit in a booth near the back, where they'd have some privacy. A waitress approached, her warm smile faltering as she took in Elliot's disheveled appearance. "What can I get you?" she asked hesitantly. "2 hot chocolates," Keanu said with a polite nod, slipping a bill into her hand. "And maybe a sandwich for the kid." As they waited, Keanu turned to Elliot, his voice low and kind. "All right, Elliot, can you tell me what happened back there? What made you think the food was poisoned? Elliot looked down at the table, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the worn surface. I saw a man talking to the vendor, he began haltingly. He gave him money and something else. I heard him say it was meant for someone important. I didn't know what he meant, but when I saw you, I thought, you thought I might be the target? Keanu finished softly. Elliot nodded, his small frame seeming to shrink further into the oversized hoodie. I didn't want to just stand there and let it happen. Keanu's chest tightened. Despite everything this boy had been through, he'd had the courage to speak up, risking ridicule, rejection, or worse, to protect a stranger. You did the right thing, Elliot, Keanu said firmly. And I'm glad you did. The waitress returned with 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate and a plate of sandwiches. Elliot hesitated before taking a sip, the warmth spreading through his cold hands and, for the first time in what felt like forever, his heart. For a moment, the two sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of clinking dishes and quiet conversations filling the space around them. But Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. And he was right. The cozy warmth of the diner couldn't mask the tension that hung in the air. Keanu watched Elliot closely as the boy hesitantly nibbled at his sandwich, his eyes darting nervously toward the door every few seconds. Something about the boy's demeanor spoke of a fear that went beyond an ordinary street encounter. Keanu leaned forward, his tone gentle yet firm. Elliot, I need you to tell me everything. Who was the man you saw? And why do you think he did this? Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he placed the half-eaten sandwich back on the plate. I didn't see his face, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He was wearing a black coat and a hat. He kept looking around like he didn't want anyone to notice him. But I was hiding by the alley, so I saw it all. Keanu nodded, encouraging him to continue. What did he say to the vendor? Elliot swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the table. He said something about a message, that it would send a clear warning. Then he handed the vendor an envelope. I couldn't hear everything, but it didn't feel right. And then, his voice cracked as he looked up, his eyes wide with fear. He saw me. The weight of the words hung heavily between them. Keanu felt a chill run down his spine, not from the cold but from the realization that this wasn't a random incident. Someone had planned this, and now Elliot was caught in the middle. Did he follow you after that? Keanu asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his mind. Elliot nodded slowly. I ran as fast as I could, but I think he did. I hid for hours before I saw you at the cart. When I saw you, I thought. He hesitated, as if unsure how to finish the sentence. You thought I'd believe you, Keanu said softly, finishing the thought for him. Elliot nodded again, his expression both grateful and vulnerable. Most people don't. They just look the other way. Keanu's jaw tightened. The thought of this boy being ignored, left to fend for himself in a city teeming with life, sparked a deep sense of responsibility in him. You did the right thing coming to me, he said firmly, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you. The promise lingered in the air, filling Elliot's eyes with a glimmer of hope that had long been absent. But even as Keanu spoke the words, his mind raced with questions. Who was the man in the black coat? What was the message he wanted to send? And why did it involve tampering with food on a bustling Manhattan street? The sound of the diner's door swinging open jolted both of them out of their thoughts. A man in a black coat stepped inside, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. Elliot froze, his small hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. That's him, Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. That's the man I saw. Keanu didn't turn immediately, his instincts kicking in. He reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Elliot's. Stay calm, he said in a low voice. We're safe here. But he wasn't so sure. The man's presence was like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. He moved slowly through the diner, his eyes lingering briefly on each patron before they landed on Keanu and Elliot. A faint smirk crossed his face, one that sent a chill down Keanu's spine. Keanu rose to his feet, positioning himself between the man and Elliot. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. The man chuckled. A low, unsettling sound. "You're quite the protector," he said, his gaze flicking briefly to Elliot before returning to Keanu. "But this doesn't concern you. Hand over the boy, and I'll be on my way." Keanu's heart pounded, but his expression remained steady. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "You need to leave." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You don't understand what you're getting involved in," he said, his tone sharp. "This boy has something that belongs to us. It's better for everyone if you just step aside." Keanu's mind raced. Something about the man's words didn't sit right. What could Elliot possibly have that was worth this level of intimidation? He glanced back at the boy, who was staring up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Keanu felt a surge of protectiveness. Whatever the truth was, he wasn't about to hand Elliot over to a stranger with sinister motives. "I don't think so," Keanu said, his voice unwavering. "Now, I suggest you leave before I call the police." The man's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flashed outside the diner's frosted windows, and moments later, 2 police officers entered the building. The man in the black coat stiffened, his smirk replaced by a tense scowl. "Hands where we can see them," one of the officers barked, his voice commanding. The man hesitated for a moment before slowly raising his hands, his gaze never leaving Keanu's. As the officers cuffed the man and led him out of the diner, he turned his head slightly, his voice low but audible enough to send a chill through Keanu. "This isn't over," he said. "You've made yourself a target now." Keanu watched as the man disappeared into the night, his mind racing with unanswered questions. He turned back to Elliot, who was still trembling in his seat. Keanu knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now," he said gently, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Whatever secrets Elliot was caught up in, they were bigger than either of them had imagined. And as much as Keanu wanted to believe the danger had passed, a gnawing feeling in his gut told him otherwise. The mystery was far from over. The flashing red and blue lights outside the diner faded into the distance as the police car drove away, carrying the man in the black coat. For a moment, there was an eerie silence, as if the entire diner was holding its breath. Keanu sat back down across from Elliot, his gaze fixed on the boy, whose small hands were still trembling as they clutched the mug of hot chocolate. "You okay, kid?" Keanu asked, his voice soft but steady. Elliot nodded faintly, though his wide eyes betrayed the fear still coursing through him. The waitress, who had been nervously watching the scene unfold, approached their table cautiously. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice shaky. Keanu glanced up and gave her a reassuring nod. "We're fine now. Thanks for checking." But as the waitress retreated, Keanu's mind churned with unease. The man's parting words, "You've made yourself a target now," echoed in his head. He leaned closer to Elliot, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Elliot, I need you to tell me the truth. Is there something you're not telling me? Something they think you have?" Elliot looked down, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. I don't know," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I don't have anything, I swear." Keanu studied the boy's face, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was raw fear and confusion. He sighed, leaning back in his seat. "All right," he said, "we'll figure this out. But right now, you're staying with me. You're not going back out there alone." Before Elliot could respond, the sound of the diner door creaking open drew their attention. Keanu turned his head, his instincts on high alert. At first glance, it seemed like just another customer, a man in a dark hoodie. his hands shoved into his pockets. But something about his movements felt off. He didn't head for the counter or take a seat like the other patrons. Instead, he lingered near the door, his head turning slightly as if scanning the room. Keanu's heart sank. This wasn't over. The man's gaze landed on their table, and his posture stiffened. Keanu's jaw clenched as the man began to approach. "Elliot," Keanu said quietly, not breaking eye contact with the stranger. "Stay behind me. Don't move." The boy nodded, slipping out of his seat and crouching behind Keanu's chair. The man stopped a few feet away, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. "You've got a lot of nerve, Reeves," he said, his voice low and dripping with menace. "Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Keanu didn't flinch. "I don't know who you are or what you're after," he replied evenly. "But you're not getting near this boy." The man chuckled darkly. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But this isn't a movie, and you're way out of your depth." Keanu stood slowly, his imposing presence seeming to fill the small space between them. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Now, I'm going to ask you once to walk away. If you don't, this won't end well for you." The tension in the room was suffocating. Other diners had stopped eating, their eyes darting nervously between Keanu and the stranger. The waitress hovered near the counter, her hand hovering over the phone. The man smirked, pulling his hands out of his pockets to reveal a small, concealed blade. The glint of metal under the diner's fluorescent lights made Keanu's pulse quicken, but his expression remained unshaken. "I'm not leaving without him," the man growled, pointing the blade toward Elliot. "Hand him over, and no one else has to get hurt." Keanu's voice dropped, cold and firm. "That's not going to happen." Before the man could react, Keanu moved with lightning speed. He grabbed a nearby chair and swung it upward, knocking the blade from the man's hand. The weapon clattered to the floor as gasps erupted from the other patrons. The man lunged forward, but Keanu sidestepped effortlessly, his movements precise and controlled. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back with a force that made the intruder cry out in pain. "I warned you," Keanu said through gritted teeth. As the man struggled, Elliot peeked out from behind the chair, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. The boy watched as Keanu maintained his composure, his grip unwavering despite the man's attempts to break free. "Call the cops," Keanu instructed the waitress, who was already dialing with trembling fingers. The man stopped struggling, his breathing ragged. "You don't know what you're getting into," he hissed. "There's more of us. This isn't over." Keanu tightened his grip, his voice low and dangerous. "Let them come. You tell whoever sent you that if they want the boy, they'll have to go through me." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air once again. 2 police officers burst through the diner doors, their weapons drawn. "Hands in the air," one of them barked. Keanu released the man and stepped back, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The officers moved quickly, pinning the man to the ground and cuffing him. As they hauled him to his feet, he cast one last venomous glance at Keanu and Elliot. "You've made a mistake," he snarled. "A big mistake." Keanu watched silently as the man was escorted out of the diner. He turned to Elliot, who was still crouched behind the chair, his small frame trembling. Keanu knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." Elliot looked up at him, his eyes brimming with tears. "Why are they after me?" he whispered. "What did I do?" Keanu's chest tightened at the boy's helplessness. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "But whatever it is, you're not facing it alone." As the diner slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, Keanu helped Elliot to his feet. The boy clung to him as they stepped outside into the cold night, the city's lights casting long shadows on the snow-dusted pavement. Keanu's mind was racing, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about protecting Elliot. It was about uncovering the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. "Come on," Keanu said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We're not going back to your street corner. I know someone who can help." And with that, the two of them disappeared into the night, their figures blending into the bustling streets of Manhattan. But the battle was far from over, and Keanu knew the real fight was only beginning. The drive to the safe house was silent, save for the soft hum of the car engine and the occasional sound of Elliot's quiet breathing. Keanu kept his eyes on the snowy road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Every so often, he glanced in the rearview mirror, scanning the darkened streets behind them for any sign of trouble. Elliot sat curled in the passenger seat, his small frame wrapped in a blanket Keanu had grabbed from the diner on their way out. The boy's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but his mind was clearly racing. Every few minutes, he'd glance over at Keanu, as if to make sure he was still there, that he hadn't been left alone again. "You doing okay?" Keanu asked softly, breaking the silence. Elliot nodded, though his voice was barely audible. "Where are we going?" Keanu offered him a reassuring smile. "To a friend's place. It's a cabin out in the woods, far from the city. No one will find us there." He hesitated before adding, "You'll be safe." Elliot didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the city lights fade into the distance. "Why are you helping me?" he asked suddenly, his voice trembling. "You don't even know me." Keanu's grip on the wheel tightened for a moment before he let out a soft sigh. "Because I know what it feels like to be alone," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "And no one should have to face that, especially not a kid like you." Elliot's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Instead, he sank deeper into the blanket, the faintest glimmer of trust beginning to surface in his eyes. The winding roads eventually gave way to dense woods, the trees standing tall and silent under a blanket of snow. Keanu slowed the car as they approached a small clearing where a cozy log cabin stood, its windows glowing softly in the dark. He pulled up next to the cabin and killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "We're here," Keanu said, turning to Elliot. "Come on, let's get you inside." Elliot hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the shadowy woods, before nodding and following Keanu out of the car. The cabin door creaked open, revealing a warm and inviting interior. A stone fireplace crackled in the corner, casting flickering light across the rustic furniture and wooden walls. The scent of pine and cedar filled the air, a comforting contrast to the icy chill outside. Keanu set down their bags and motioned for Elliot to sit near the fire. "Warm up. I'll grab you something to eat." Elliot obeyed, sinking into a worn armchair and holding his hands out toward the flames. For the first time in what felt like forever, he began to feel a semblance of safety, though the fear in the back of his mind refused to fully dissipate. Keanu returned a few minutes later with a plate of sandwiches and a steaming mug of tea. He placed them on the small table beside Elliot and took a seat across from him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "All right," Keanu began, his voice gentle but firm. "We need to talk. I know you're scared, and I don't blame you, but I need to understand what's going on if I'm going to help you. Can you tell me more about your mom?" Elliot hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. She disappeared a few years ago," he said softly. "She used to work at a big company downtown. She said it was important work, but she didn't talk about it much. Then one day, she didn't come home." Keanu's brows furrowed. "Did she ever mention what kind of work she did? Or anyone she worked with?" Elliot shook his head. "Not really, but sometimes I'd hear her on the phone, talking about things that didn't make sense, like files and secrets." His voice faltered. "She told me not to tell anyone. She said it was for my safety." Keanu leaned back, his mind racing. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed was far from clear. It sounded like Elliot's mother had been involved in something dangerous, something that had now put her son in harm's way. "Do you think she's still out there?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu hesitated, his heart aching at the boy's hopefulness. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But if she is, we'll find her." Elliot nodded, though his expression remained clouded with uncertainty. He stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you think those men will come back?" Keanu's jaw tightened. "Not if I can help it," he said firmly. "They won't hurt you. Not while I'm around." The boy's gaze shifted to Keanu, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. "Why are you so nice to me?" he asked. "Most people, they just walk past me, like I don't even exist." Keanu's throat tightened. He thought of his own past, the moments when he had felt invisible, forgotten. He thought of the people who had reached out to him when he needed it most. "Because you do exist, Elliot," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you matter. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't." For the first time that night, a small smile tugged at the corners of Elliot's lips. It was faint and fleeting, but it was there. And for Keanu, it was enough. The hours passed in quiet companionship. Elliot eventually fell asleep on the couch, his small frame wrapped in a thick blanket. Keanu sat nearby, staring into the fire as his mind churned with thoughts of what lay ahead. He didn't know who these men were or what they wanted. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let them get to Elliot. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Keanu made a silent vow. He would protect this boy with everything he had. Because in the quiet moments of the night, as he watched Elliot sleep peacefully for the first time in who knows how long, Keanu realized something profound. Elliot wasn't just a boy in need of help. He was a reminder of the strength that could be found in even the smallest act of kindness, and of the courage it took to stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. And for Keanu, that was a fight worth everything. The cabin was quiet. The only sounds the faint crackle of the dying fire and the soft rhythm of Elliot's breathing as he slept on the couch. Keanu sat near the window, his eyes scanning the dark forest outside. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the ground and muffling the world beyond. It was peaceful, but Keanu's instincts told him it wouldn't last. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The man's parting words at the diner, "This isn't over," echoed in his mind, a warning that refused to be ignored. His fingers tightened around the edge of the curtain as he scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a shadow flickered near the edge of the woods. Keanu's heart jumped, but his years of discipline and control kept his reaction measured. He leaned closer to the window, narrowing his eyes against the falling snow. The shadow moved again, this time closer. It wasn't an animal. The deliberate way it moved told him it was something or someone else. Keanu's jaw tightened. He turned away from the window and crossed the room in a few quiet strides. Crouching next to Elliot, gently, he shook the boy's shoulder. "Elliot," he whispered. "Wake up." Elliot stirred, blinking sleepily. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion. Keanu kept his voice calm, steady. "I need you to get up and stay quiet." "Okay." "Someone's outside." Elliot's eyes widened, the grogginess fading as fear took its place. He nodded quickly, throwing off the blanket and slipping off the couch. Keanu grabbed his coat and handed it to the boy. "Put this on and stay close to me." As Elliot bundled himself up, Keanu reached for his phone and quickly sent a message to Lawrence, his trusted friend who owned the cabin. It was a simple message: "We've got company. Send backup." Lawrence was only a few miles away, and Keanu trusted him to act fast. Keanu guided Elliot to a small storage room at the back of the cabin. It was cramped but hidden, the perfect spot to keep Elliot safe. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice firm but kind. "Don't come out until I say it's okay. No matter what you hear, you stay put." "Got it." Elliot hesitated, his small hands clutching the coat tightly. "What if something happens to you?" he asked, his voice trembling. Keanu crouched down, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Nothing's going to happen to me," he said, his tone reassuring. "I've got this. Trust me." Elliot nodded reluctantly, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Keanu gave him a small, encouraging smile before stepping out of the room and closing the door behind him. The cabin was eerily silent as Keanu moved toward the front door, his senses on high alert. He reached for a sturdy wooden poker near the fireplace, gripping it tightly as he glanced out the window again. The shadow was gone, but that didn't mean the danger had passed. A sudden knock on the door shattered the quiet, the sound loud and deliberate. Keanu froze, his grip tightening on the poker. Another knock followed, slower this time, almost taunting. Keanu took a deep breath, centering himself. He stepped toward the door, his movements careful and measured. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady. A moment of silence passed before a familiar voice replied, low and mocking. "We told you this wasn't over." Keanu's stomach churned. He peered through the peephole and saw a man in a black coat standing on the porch, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Behind him, two more figures emerged from the tree line, their postures menacing. Keanu opened the door just enough to meet the man's gaze. "You've got the wrong place," he said coldly. "Turn around and leave." The man smirked. "You're protecting the boy, aren't you?" he said, leaning closer. "Do you even know what you're risking? He's not just some street kid, Reeves. He's the key to something much bigger." Keanu's expression didn't waver. "I don't care what you think he is. You're not getting near him." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a hardened glare. "We don't need your permission." Before Keanu could react, the man motioned to the figures behind him. They rushed forward, their movements fast and precise. Keanu slammed the door shut, bolting it just as the first man reached the porch. The sound of fists pounding against the door echoed through the cabin. Keanu grabbed a nearby chair and wedged it under the doorknob for extra security. He knew it wouldn't hold them for long. He turned and hurried back to the storage room. "Elliot," he said, opening the door. The boy looked up at him, his face pale with fear. "We need to move. Now." Elliot nodded and followed Keanu out of the room. Keanu led him to a back window and opened it, the icy wind cutting through the warmth of the cabin. "Climb out and run toward the woods," Keanu instructed. "There's a shed about 50 yards out. Hide there. I'll find you." Elliot hesitated, his eyes wide. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Keanu promised. "Now go." Elliot nodded, scrambling out the window and disappearing into the snow-covered woods. Keanu closed the window behind him, his breath visible in the cold air. He turned back toward the front door just as it splintered open, the sound of wood cracking under force echoing through the cabin. The men entered, their faces set with grim determination. Keanu stood his ground, gripping the poker tightly. "You've made a mistake coming here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. One of the men chuckled. "The only mistake here is yours. Hand over the boy, and we'll make this quick." Keanu didn't respond. Instead, he lunged forward, his movements swift and calculated. The poker connected with the first man's shoulder, sending him staggering back. The second man rushed at Keanu, but he sidestepped, using the momentum to shove the man into the wall. The fight was chaotic, the confined space of the cabin adding to the intensity. Keanu's years of experience gave him the upper hand, but the men were relentless, their attacks driven by something far deeper than money or orders. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps outside made the attackers pause. Lawrence burst through the open door, his shotgun raised. "That's enough," he barked, his voice commanding. The men hesitated before retreating, their expressions dark. "This isn't over," the leader growled, his gaze locking with Keanu's one last time before they disappeared into the woods. Lawrence lowered his shotgun, his face etched with concern. "You all right?" he asked. Keanu nodded, his chest heaving from the exertion. "Elliot's in the shed," he said. "Let's get him." As they made their way into the woods, Keanu's resolve only grew stronger. Whatever secrets Elliot was tied to, Keanu knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop fighting until the boy was truly safe. The icy air bit at Keanu's skin as he trudged through the snow-covered woods, his breath visible in the pale moonlight. Each step was deliberate, his senses on high alert for any sound or movement that could signal danger. Beside him, Lawrence moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen his fair share of conflict. The shotgun in his hands was steady, its barrel glinting in the faint glow filtering through the trees. "Elliot should be just ahead," Keanu said, his voice low but resolute. They reached the small shed tucked beneath the canopy of frost-covered pines. Keanu rapped his knuckles against the wooden door softly. "Elliot, it's me," he called out. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Elliot's pale, frightened face. The boy's eyes darted behind Keanu, scanning the darkness for signs of the men who had invaded the cabin. "Are they gone?" he whispered. "For now," Keanu said, crouching to meet his gaze. "But we don't have much time. We need to get ready for what's coming." Elliot nodded, stepping out of the shed. His small frame shivered against the cold, and Keanu quickly draped his own scarf around the boy's neck. "Stay close to me," Keanu said firmly, gripping Elliot's shoulder. "No matter what happens, I won't let them take you." The three of them made their way back to the cabin, the woods eerily silent around them. Once inside, Lawrence secured the shattered front door as best as he could, while Keanu led Elliot to the couch. "Sit tight," Keanu said, handing him a flashlight. "If anything happens, shine this at the window. We'll see it." Elliot nodded, clutching the flashlight tightly as Keanu and Lawrence moved toward the kitchen. The tension was palpable, the weight of what was to come hanging heavily in the air. "They'll be back," Lawrence said, loading shells into his shotgun with practiced ease. "And they'll bring more men." Keanu leaned against the counter, his jaw tight. "They're not going to stop until they get him," he said, his voice low but determined. "We have to end this tonight." Lawrence glanced at him, his expression serious. "You sure about this? You're putting yourself in their crosshairs." Keanu's gaze flicked toward the living room, where Elliot sat curled up on the couch. The boy's small hands clutched the flashlight like it was a lifeline. "I don't have a choice," Keanu said. "That kid needs someone to fight for him." Lawrence nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "All right then, let's make sure we're ready." The hours passed slowly, the cabin's warmth doing little to ease the chill of anticipation. Keanu and Lawrence set up makeshift barricades, positioning furniture and heavy objects near the windows and doors. They placed flashlights and lanterns strategically, their beams illuminating the cabin's perimeter. Elliot watched silently, his eyes wide as he took in their preparations. He felt a mix of fear and awe as he watched Keanu move with purpose, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. Then, as the clock crept toward midnight, it began. The first sign was the crunch of footsteps in the snow, deliberate and measured. Keanu froze, his hand gripping the wooden poker he had used earlier. He exchanged a glance with Lawrence, who nodded silently. The two men moved toward the windows, peering into the darkness. Shadows moved just beyond the tree line, their figures barely discernible in the dim light. Keanu's pulse quickened, but his face remained impassive. "They're here," he said quietly. A voice called out from the darkness, cold and commanding. "Reeves, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Hand over the boy, and we'll leave you in peace." Keanu stepped to the front door, his expression calm but his eyes steely. "If you wanted peace," he called back, "you wouldn't be here." The voice laughed, a hollow sound that sent a chill through the air. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but you're outnumbered, outmatched. Do yourself a favor and walk away." Keanu didn't respond. Instead, he glanced back at Lawrence, who gave a subtle nod. They were ready, The first attack came swiftly. The figure lunged toward the front door, only to be met with the solid resistance of the barricade. Keanu moved quickly, shoving the door shut as Lawrence fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the woods, a clear signal that they weren't going down without a fight. From the living room, Elliot crouched low, his heart pounding as he heard the commotion. He clutched the flashlight, his knuckles white, and prayed silently that Keanu's promise would hold true. The men outside regrouped, their shadows flickering as they circled the cabin. One of them threw a heavy object at the window, shattering the glass. Keanu reacted instantly, grabbing a lantern and hurling it through the broken pane. The burst of light momentarily disoriented the attackers, giving Keanu and Lawrence precious seconds to reposition. "Stay close," Keanu shouted to Lawrence as they moved to cover the back of the cabin. Another window shattered, and two men tried to climb through, but Lawrence was faster. His shotgun roared, forcing the intruders to retreat. Elliot flinched at the sound of gunfire, tears streaming down his face as he huddled in the corner. But even through his fear, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Keanu and Lawrence were fighting for him, risking everything to keep him safe. Outside, the leader of the group growled in frustration. "Enough games," he barked. "Take them down." The attackers surged forward, their movements coordinated and relentless. Keanu and Lawrence fought with everything they had, their determination outweighing their fatigue. Keanu's strikes were precise, each swing of the poker calculated to disable rather than kill. Lawrence's shotgun rang out, its deafening blasts keeping the intruders at bay. But the fight was far from over. One of the men managed to break through a side window, slipping inside undetected. He moved silently toward the living room, his eyes locking on Elliot's trembling form. "Don't move," the man hissed, reaching for the boy. But Elliot wasn't as helpless as he seemed. Remembering Keanu's advice, he turned the flashlight on and aimed it directly at the man's face, the sudden burst of light blinding him. Elliot scrambled to his feet and bolted toward the kitchen, shouting, "Keanu!" Keanu spun around just in time to see the intruder stumbling, disoriented by the flashlight. With a single, powerful swing, Keanu struck the man, sending him crashing to the floor. "Good job, kid," Keanu said, his voice filled with pride despite the chaos. "Stay behind me." The tide of the fight began to shift. The attackers, realizing they had underestimated their opponents, began to falter. One by one, they retreated into the woods, their leader shouting curses as he disappeared into the darkness. The cabin fell silent once more, the echoes of the battle fading into the night. Keanu and Lawrence stood in the wreckage, their breaths heavy, their bodies bruised but unbroken. Elliot emerged from his hiding spot, his small frame trembling but his eyes filled with newfound determination. Keanu knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. Elliot nodded, his voice shaky but firm. "I am now." Lawrence leaned against the wall, his shotgun resting at his side. "Looks like we sent them packing," he said with a weary smile. Keanu nodded, his gaze shifting toward the shattered windows and the snow-covered ground beyond. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "But so will we." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the three of them stood together in the ruined cabin, united by a bond forged in the fire of adversity. For Keanu, it wasn't just about protecting Elliot anymore. It was about fighting for something bigger, hope, resilience, and the belief that even in the darkest of times, the light of kindness could prevail. The morning sun spilled through the broken windows of the cabin, casting soft golden light over the remnants of the night's chaos. The snow outside sparkled like tiny diamonds, belying the tension that had gripped the small haven just hours before. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with exhaustion, but there was also a quiet sense of relief. They had made it through the night. Keanu stood in the kitchen, carefully bandaging a scrape on his arm. His movements were slow, methodical, and his mind replayed the events of the battle. He glanced into the living room, where Elliot sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. The boy was quiet, staring at the floor, but his expression had shifted. The fear that had once clouded his eyes was giving way to something else. Hope. Lawrence entered the room, carrying a small duffel bag. "I've got a friend in law enforcement," he said, breaking the silence. "Someone I trust. They can help us figure out who those men were and why they're after the boy." Keanu nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's time we got some answers." Elliot looked up, his small voice breaking the quiet. "Do you really think they'll stop if we find out the truth?" Keanu crossed the room and crouched in front of him, his steady gaze meeting the boy's. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But I do know this, we're not going to let them hurt you. You're not alone in this anymore." "Elliot." The boy blinked, his eyes welling with tears. "I've been alone for so long," he whispered. "I didn't think anyone would ever care." Keanu's chest tightened. "You're not invisible, Elliot," he said firmly. "And you matter. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Lawrence cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "If we're going to meet my contact, we need to move soon. The longer we stay here, the riskier it gets." Keanu helped Elliot to his feet, grabbing a few essentials and packing them into a bag. Before they left, he took one last look around the cabin. It had been a sanctuary, a place of protection, but it was clear that their fight wasn't over. The drive into the city was tense but quiet. Elliot sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the snowy woods gave way to bustling streets. Keanu occasionally glanced at him in the rearview mirror, noting how small he seemed in the oversized jacket. But there was a new strength in the boy's posture. They arrived at a discreet location, a nondescript office building tucked between towering skyscrapers. Inside, Lawrence's contact, a seasoned detective named Maria, greeted them with a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened intently as they recounted the events of the past few days, her sharp eyes narrowing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "So let me get this straight," Maria said, leaning back in her chair. "Elliot's mother worked for a major corporation, handling classified information, and then she disappeared. Now these men think Elliot has access to whatever secrets she was protecting." Keanu nodded. "That's the gist of it. But Elliot doesn't know anything. He's just a kid caught in the middle." Maria tapped her fingers on the desk, her mind working quickly. "If this is tied to corporate espionage or worse, organized crime, it explains why they're so relentless. They think he's the key to something valuable." She turned to Elliot, her tone softening. "Elliot, do you remember anything your mom might have said or left behind? Something they could be looking for?" Elliot hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought. "She had a notebook," he said slowly. "She always carried it with her. I never saw what was inside, but she told me it was important." Maria nodded. "Do you know where it is now?" Elliot shook his head. "It disappeared when she did." Keanu placed a reassuring hand on Elliot's shoulder. "We'll find it," he said. "Whatever it takes." Maria leaned forward, her expression serious. "If we're going to protect him, we need to act fast. I can put him into protective custody, but it might mean separating you two." Keanu's jaw tightened. The thought of leaving Elliot alone again was unbearable. "No," he said firmly. "He stays with me." Maria studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, but you'll need to stay off the grid. I'll set up a safe house for you, and I'll dig into his mother's case. If there's a way to stop these people, we'll find it." As they left Maria's office, Elliot clung to Keanu's side. "You're not going to leave me, are you?" he asked, his voice small. Keanu stopped and knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "Never," he said. "We're in this together." The days that followed were a mix of tension and quiet moments of healing. At the new safe house, tucked away in a remote location, Elliot began to open up more. He shared stories about his mother, his life before she disappeared, and the dreams he had buried beneath years of fear. Keanu listened intently, offering words of encouragement and reassurance. He taught Elliot small things: how to build a fire, how to tie knots, how to defend himself if ever cornered. These moments, though simple, became the foundation of a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Elliot looked at Keanu with a tentative smile. "Do you think my mom would be proud of me?" Keanu's throat tightened. "I know she would be," he said. "You're brave, Elliot. Braver than most adults I know." The boy's smile widened, the faint glow of confidence beginning to return to his eyes. Then, one day, a call came from Maria. She had found the notebook, hidden in a safety deposit box under Elliot's mother's name. It contained evidence that exposed a powerful criminal network, the same one that had targeted Elliot. With this information, the authorities could dismantle the organization once and for all. As the operation unfolded, Keanu and Elliot stayed in the safe house, waiting for news. When Maria finally called to confirm that the arrests had been made, Keanu felt a wave of relief wash over him. The threat was over. For the first time in years, Elliot could breathe freely. But the boy's journey wasn't over. Keanu made a decision that surprised even himself. He would adopt Elliot, giving him the stable, loving home he had longed for. The final scene was simple but powerful. Keanu and Elliot walking side by side through a quiet park. The weight of the past finally lifted. Elliot looked up at Keanu, his smile brighter than ever. "Thanks for not giving up on me," he said. Keanu smiled back, his voice steady and warm. "Thanks for letting me." It wasn't just a story about survival, it was a story about finding hope, family, and the courage to face the darkness. And for both Keanu and Elliot, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with promise and light. The finality of Maria's call brought a quiet calm to the safe house. The criminal network that had haunted Elliot's life was dismantled, their leaders arrested, and the evidence his mother had so carefully guarded was now in the right hands. Keanu hung up the phone and turned to Elliot, who sat on the couch, his small hands clutching a warm mug of cocoa. "It's over," Keanu said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're safe now." Elliot blinked, as if the words hadn't quite registered. "Really?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. Keanu nodded. "Really, they're gone. They can't hurt you anymore." For a moment, Elliot just sat there, the weight of years of fear and uncertainty finally lifting. Then, slowly, tears began to stream down his face. He set the mug down and stood, throwing his arms around Keanu in a tight embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for everything." Keanu held him close, his own throat tightening with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, kid. I just did what anyone should have." But deep down, they both knew that wasn't true. Keanu had gone beyond what anyone else might have done, and Elliot would never forget it. The next few weeks were a blur of new beginnings. Maria helped finalize the paperwork to ensure Elliot's safety, and Keanu began the process of officially adopting him. The boy, once shy and unsure, started to come into his own, his confidence growing with each passing day. One afternoon, Keanu and Elliot stood on the porch of their new home, a modest but cozy house with a sprawling backyard. It was a far cry from the streets of New York, and for Elliot, it felt like a dream he hadn't dared to wish for. "You think I'll be any good at school?" Elliot asked, his voice tinged with nervousness as he kicked at a stray pebble. Keanu crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I think you'll be great," he said with a reassuring smile. "And if you ever need help, I'll be right there." Elliot looked up at him, his eyes bright. "You mean it?" Keanu grinned. "Of course. We're a team now. Remember?" Elliot smiled, a genuine, wide smile that seemed to light up the entire yard. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, like he had a family. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Keanu and Elliot sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge one by one. The air was crisp and cool, but there was a warmth between them that no amount of winter chill could touch. Keanu, Elliot said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Yeah, kid. I used to wish I had someone who cared about me, Elliot admitted, his voice trembling slightly. Someone who wouldn't leave. Keanu turned to him, his expression gentle but firm. You've got that now, he said. And I'm not going anywhere. Elliot smiled again, his small frame leaning against Keanu's side. They sat there together, wrapped in the quiet peace of their new life. The stars above them a silent witness to the bond they had forged through fire and hardship. As the night deepened, Keanu glanced down at the boy who had changed his life in ways he never expected. You know, Elliot, he said, his voice soft, you've taught me something important. Elliot looked up at him, curious. What's that? That even in the darkest moments, Keanu said, his gaze drifting to the starry sky. Kindness and hope can change everything. Elliot nodded thoughtfully, his small hand reaching for Keanu's. I think we both learned that. And with those simple, heartfelt words, the two of them sat together under the stars, their hearts full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them together. In a world often filled with darkness, they had found their light in each other. And this, they both knew, was only the beginning of a new, brighter chapter